The film begins by showing a guy named Eddie working at a donut shop, with a young couple dating in front of him. The couple can no longer resist their lust, and ask Eddie for permission to use the restroom to be intimate. Eddie refuses, which angers the couple, and they throw a donut at Eddie that was being sold. Eddie goes home feeling upset and drained by the incident. When he arrives home, he finds his housemate engaging in intimate activities in his room. This further worsens Eddie's mood, but his friends named Jet and his girlfriend Ellie apologize to Eddie, who appears to be having a difficult day. They give Eddie a letter. It turns out that Eddie applied for a teaching job, but was not accepted. Initially, Eddie feels hopeless, but after his friends encourage him, he becomes optimistic about going to the school department for an interview to determine whether he will be accepted or not. The next morning, Eddie arrives at the department with enthusiasm and meets the person in charge of hiring new teachers. There, Eddie requests an interview, and long story short, the interview goes well, and Eddie gets a new job. He returns home and finds Jet and Ellie once again being intimate there. He immediately informs his friend that he got the job, but there is one more problem. He has to separate from them because his workplace is far away. Jet doesn't mind and continues to support his friend. The next day, Eddie sets off. There, he rents an apartment where the caretaker named Sydney likes to listen to people moaning. However, at night, Eddie feels bored and goes to a club downstairs where Sydney is. Eddie starts telling his story while listening to jazz music, and from there, Eddie and Sydney seem to become quite close. The next day, Eddie starts teaching at school, but the students don't care about him and are rather rebellious. While teaching, a female student asks for permission to go to the restroom, and a male student named Leon bullies Eddie. Suddenly, the female student who just returned from the restroom starts crying because she is bleeding and thinks she has a disease. Eddie, understanding that she is experiencing her menstrual period, quickly fetches a pad for her. However, the student doesn't know how to use it. In the end, Eddie calls Ellie to come and help the girl. After finishing teaching, Eddie notices that a student named Tito hasn't gone home yet, and when he is picked up, it turns out that Tito's sister is incredibly beautiful. Eddie immediately tries to introduce himself. Unfortunately, the beautiful girl named Pilar already has a boyfriend named Hector. And Tito and his sister go home with Hector, leaving Eddie behind. Upon returning from there, Jet and Ellie are at the club beneath Eddie's apartment. There, they discuss the importance of sex education for teenagers, and Eddie once again feels miserable because Jet and Ellie are showing more affection towards each other. Jet offers to introduce Eddie to one of his female friends. The next day, Eddie starts teaching sex education in his spare time. However, the students there consider it a joke, and Leon once again annoys Eddie until Eddie finally instructs Leon to see the headmaster, and Leon's parents are called in. While in the restroom, Eddie accidentally meets Leon's father, who is scolding his son. It turns out Leon's father is a pastor. Initially, Leon's father apologizes for his son's behavior, but after finding out that his son is learning about sex, he gets angry at Eddie, accusing him of provoking the students by discussing a taboo topic. Eddie goes home and immediately goes to the club to wait for the girl he was supposed to meet. When the girl arrives, she turns out to be quite attractive, but unable to control her thirst. Eddie is taken to a private room and invited to be intimate, but he refuses and is called a gay by the girl. The girl leaves Eddie, who becomes sad and gets drunk at the club, accompanied by Sydney, who comforts Eddie in his sadness. The next day, Eddie continues teaching sex education. Initially, the students mock him again, but after Eddie shows them the horrors of sexually transmitted diseases, the students become willing to learn. After school, Eddie meets Tito again, who hasn't been picked up by his sister. Eddie spends some time talking to Tito, and Tito confides in Eddie about his girlfriend. Eddie, considering it puppy love, gives Tito some advice. When Tito's sister arrives, Pilar invites Eddie to have a dinner at their house because Tito often talks about Eddie as the coolest teacher. Eddie is very happy and gets ready for dinner. Upon arrival, Eddie is greeted by Tito's mother. Tito's mother thanks Eddie for helping Tito mature. However, Tito's mother, who is very attractive, teasingly asks Eddie to massage the seasoning into the chicken while being flirty. After that, Hector arrives and reluctantly smiles at Eddie. While waiting for the meal to be ready, they start drinking. Hector confronts Eddie, accusing him of trying to get close to Pilar. Hector tells Eddie that he should have told Pilar that he was busy, so Eddie didn't have to come for dinner. Hector then forces Eddie to drink alcohol, and during dinner, Hector challenges Eddie to eat fish eyes. Challenged by Hector, Eddie eats the fish eyes, but ends up vomiting in front of Tito's mother. Out of embarrassment, Eddie leaves immediately. As usual, Eddie, who feeling stressed, goes to the club where Sydney is, and Sydney once again encourages him. The next day, Eddie brings Ellie and Jet to his class to give a presentation. With Jet and Ellie's presence, Eddie's class becomes even more exciting and enjoyable. After school, Eddie accompanies Tito while waiting for his sister and plays soccer. When Pilar arrives, Eddie apologizes for the previous night's incident. Eddie then invited Pilar to go on a date. Unexpectedly, Pilar accepted Eddie's invitation, and they agreed to meet at the club below Eddie's apartment. Meanwhile, someone who hired Eddie as a teacher found out about his intimate lesson. Eddie was called in, and he received punishment for teaching about it. The next day, during class, Eddie announced that the intimate education was no longer exist. Hearing that, many students dispersed. Eddie approached Tito and asked him how he felt about Eddie dating his sister. Surprisingly, Tito agreed to it, which boosted Eddie's confidence in dating Pilar. After that, Eddie approached Leon's father, who is a pastor, seeking his understanding about the importance of intimate education. Eddie even offered Leon's father to observe his class and decide whether he liked it before making any judgments. Eventually, Leon's father agreed, and the class continued. However, the students were joking around and mocking during the class, which made Leon's father angry, leading him to leave the classroom. Eddie tried to persuade Leon's father, but it seemed that he was already upset with the situation being considered normal in the class. Eddie became discouraged. After school, Tito approached Eddie and informed him about him wanting to intimate with someone and asking for a balloon from Eddie for safety purposes. Initially, Eddie hesitated to give it, but eventually he gave the balloon to Tito under his insistence. That evening, Eddie went on a date with Pilar, but their conversation kept shifting towards Tito until Eddie accidentally mentioned giving a balloon to Tito for his date. This surprised Pilar, who immediately went home to confront Tito. As expected, Tito was preparing for his own date. Pilar became angry with Eddie and told him to leave. On the way home, Hector confronted Eddie and attacked him for trying to take his girlfriend. Frustrated, Eddie decided to hire a call girl to help him forget his sadness. Unfortunately, he was caught by the local police, and it turned out that the person he hired was a ladyboy. Jet, who happened to be a police officer, helped Eddie get released. Eddie was now even more distraught and confided in Jet. Jet could only encourage Eddie and advised him to lower his standards for women to find happiness. In the evening, when Eddie arrived at his classroom, he was surprised to find the principal there. It turned out that Eddie had been fired from his job. Eddie was completely devastated and ended up working at a donut shop again. Sydney, who cared about him, visited Eddie at his current workplace and told him that he could be Pilar's boyfriend if he could express his feelings properly. Eddie mustered up the courage and immediately went to see Pilar, expressing his feelings while playing a clarinet. Pilar, who was interested in Eddie, finally accepted him as her boyfriend. But Eddie made a mistake by going through Pilar's regular club. There, Pilar entered the club alone and told Eddie that she would only be a short while. However, the bouncer convinced Eddie that Pilar wouldn't come back. Eddie started to worry because he was left alone on their first date. To make matters worse, Hector suddenly appeared from behind and challenged Eddie. Exhausted and fed up, Eddie eventually punched Hector until the police arrived and intervened. Once again, Eddie was saved by Jet. They continued their conversation at Sydney's club. There, Eddie was motivated to prove to all the parents and teachers that what he was teaching was valuable, and the students enjoyed it. The next day, Eddie gathered his students for a parent-teacher meeting. He demonstrated that lessons about intimate were truly beneficial, as it was better for students to learn from teachers rather than from the internet. Surprisingly, the parents' response was very positive. Eddie regained their trust to teach again. Eddie went home, and suddenly Pilar arrived to congratulate him and want to take his virginity. However, Pilar said something that made Eddie feel belittled, and their intimate moment failed. Eddie went down to the club, where Ellie, Jet, and Sydney were already there. Eddie was once again heartbroken, but his friends motivated him. Then the scene changed to 1 year later, where Eddie became more confident in the knowledge he taught, and the students were thrilled with him. The film concluded with a Canadian woman who wanted to learn about intimate education from Eddie, and the story ended.